right, so welcome everybody. I can see we have 24 people here tonight, so this is very exciting. So welcome to the next edition of Sustainable Stow in cooperation with the Randall Library. We're excited you all could make it tonight. I don't have a presentation or an introduction for Casey-lee, so I'm going to hand it over to Rick. I think he has a few words to talk about our presenter tonight.
Thanks, Tina.
Yeah.
And hello, everybody. Yeah, we do make a lot of use of Stow TV and recordings because we realize that with everybody's schedule, the recordings mean a lot. Like last month's program on Lake Boone, we had like 5 times more people watch the recording than were with us that night. So it helps us get a broader coverage, and that's important because from Sustainable Stow, we're really concerned about just getting some information out to the town as a whole, to everyone. And I want to thank Tina and Randall Library for hosting us. It's been great, and we will continue. We've got a very different and exciting program coming up on the future of housing next month. What kind of houses should we be building in Stow? And we'll have more information about that soon. But for tonight, I want to welcome Casey-lee Bastien. Casey-lee is Landscape Architect with BSC Group. He specializes in habitat restoration and ecological design. And I can say that from walking around with him in a variety of Stow properties, his insights, he came up with things, comments. I was like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Well, that's interesting. Great stuff. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation. I really appreciate the fact that you spent the time with us to look around the town, to look at some selected properties and give us some interesting insights. So Casey-lee, where are you? You're over to you.
Hello. Thank you, Rick. In addition to introduction, I'll say for what we're going to do tonight, first, I don't typically design residential landscapes. I used to, but now I work at a larger municipal and regional scale. And from that vantage point, I can see just how impactful home landscapes are on overall ecology, and how they could, with a few tweaks, play a really vital role in ecological resilience overall. Second, I'm not an expert in ecology, though I do know a lot of little things at that sort of level. Thank you, Rick. I'm a designer, and I have to make decisions about what to value and what should I build, what do my clients want, and what do my ecologists recommend. As homeowners, I expect you've got a similar challenge, but without the time and resources at my disposal. And since each choice comes down to perspective and our motives, I'd like to share some of the principles I consider to decide what's important in the moment and in each landscape. So when you're a decision maker, everybody has advice or a product or a potion to sell to you, and you and I have to decide what's right, who to plant and what to keep and where to do it. So over and over again, what I find is the right thing to do tends to hinge on our support for keystone species. And those are trees, soil builders, pollinators, and birds. These are species that bridge and connect systems. Amongst those, we're probably the most influential species of all, or we could become one of those keystone species if we help to make those connections. I'm hoping that doesn't sound like new work or more work, because people can be tempted to default back to old ways, use a mower and a blower. But with some basic understanding of what nature is doing, we can do less and spend less and get more out of our landscape simply by opening up some of these possibility is to let nature do its work for us, and make ecological landscaping sort of our new normal. I think we'll hop over to some of the sites now, and forgive me, these will be video clips. Forgive me if I ramble or fluff some details in the clips. I'm visiting these landscapes for the first time and speaking them to them live and in one take. So for structure, I'll occasionally interrupt or pop some things into the chat.
Hello, here we are on Hudson Street in Stow, and we're going to look around the garden and discuss some things about what we're seeing, how they function, and how we're using our land to its fullest. What we can do for habitat in the garden and for ourselves. Now, we've got a lovely home, beautiful vegetable patches. Some of the biggest things that we can do for things like energy conservation and carbon really happen inside the home and happen relative to how we consume things. But the landscape plays this alternate part about building flexibility and bringing things together. So what we're looking for are ways that we can find these sort of emergent properties where different things come together to build strength and build relationships. And one of the first ones that I'd like to describe is this relationship between the forest edge and the meadow and the garden. Now, relative to our keystone species, these end up being our pollinators and our birds. These are the ones who are moving genetic code around. Our birds are moving seed from place to place, and our pollinators are moving pollen and genetic code between plants so that they can readapt. It's the only way that they can change and grow and change their positions relative to things like climate change or new invasions of other species. So we want to be the species that's supporting them in doing their job. The way to...
I'm going to pause there for a moment. This is me interjecting on things I'm saying there, but that bit about tree edge habitat and the things in our garden, one of the ways we sort of model that is thinking about what was there before as a healthy habitat. And that would be things like the landscapes created by indigenous people, by burning, or by beavers that flood land and clear it. Those are things that create these type of edge habitats. So that's what we want our gardens to mimic in some way, so that we've got that heavy edge of rapid growth because of the extra sunlight. So we're getting lots of foliage, seed, flowers. These are things that our gardens can emulate for good ecology.
Way to understand that in your own landscape is that the forest, particularly the forest edge, is the grocery store. Our landscape is a clearing in the woods. It's where sunlight is coming in, so there's extra energy, soft foliage, fruit, and flowers happening. And a lot of that happens outside of our cone of vision that's happening up in the canopy. Down low, where we tend to see the birds, the butterflies, the bees in our garden, this is more like a pharmacy. Down here, they're getting pollen and seeds from a lot of different varieties. The key ends up being we want to supply the larval hosts and things like honeydew in our trees, and that makes native trees really essential. Down in the garden, you've got a little bit more flexibility because we find that urban and suburban areas can actually have more benefit to some of those birds and pollinators than rural landscapes. In particular, because we've got that diversity of plants, even when it includes some foreign plants. So you can forgive yourself a couple of things, provided you have a decent balance and mass of good things to eat in the garden. The next thing I want to talk about is how we're using our space. We're very object-oriented, and we kind of see things in their place as what they are, and we forget about the empty areas and the margins. They become the elbows and the armpits of the world. But that's where we have an opportunity to do good things and to create some changes. So looking out and across, we have portions of the meadow, the garden, the fruit trees, but there are a lot of areas where the only thing that's going to happen here is mowing a lawn. There are spaces where we gather and sit, but they tend to be a fair bit smaller than what we're mowing. Lawnmowers are bad for you. I have to say it this way. But your lawnmower puts out more toxic chemicals in its exhaust than 11 cars combined. And that's mostly carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide, laughing gas. And both of those are, by orders of magnitude, more of a greenhouse gas than carbon itself. So not only are you being poisoned when you're doing this, you're also creating this tremendous greenhouse gas effect, but you're not necessarily doing it for your own use. Now, when you've got a space with children and you want a nice big flat area, this is perfect actually. But there are corners, edges, slopes. These are the kind of things that it's worth considering whether or not you spend any time there, and whether you want to keep investing your time in making that release of gases and having that monoculture that doesn't lend itself to the environment in the same way. So next time you're looking at your own yard, decide what really matters to you and what things you maybe want to change your investment on. Have play space, have gathering space, but let some things go.
So, one question, you mentioned native trees. What constitutes a native tree, and what if I just like a tree, but maybe I know it's not native? It's called Japanese maple, let's say.
Now, I kind of dodged that question on him, and I'm doing it because it's complex. Native can mean regionally native, continentally native, naturalized. It's a broad spectrum, and it can be case specific to what you want. Imagine we'd say a monarch butterfly is native, but we might say that a petunia isn't native, except that's the natural food for one, just happens to be natural in Mexico. The next thing he's going to put me on the spot with is because we're standing right next to someone's Japanese maple tree. So we'll let him have at it.
It's called Japanese maple, let's say.
Oh. You know what? By and large, you can let yourself have a good ornamental tree, a specimen tree. Even these have something to offer. And the way we say that, you know, a non-native tree lacks value, it has more to do with the community it's in. If you are the larval host of Japanese maple, you're in serious danger because there aren't many of them. It'd be a rare thing to find. So you have to be a larval host to oak and pine and maple if you're going to live here. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that are going to take advantage of that. It still has structure. It's still taking in carbon, creating shade, and holding moisture in the ground. That other big relationship ends up being, if you were going to have a lawn anyway, have a Japanese maple instead, because it's going to do more for holding moisture and creating space and shade than than the nothing.
So many of us have Norway maples.
To that, I'll point out something like a Japanese maple is sort of like owning a poodle. Very cute, but mostly useless. It's not going to go herd sheep for you, and the Japanese maple isn't going to host important species for you. So that's the consideration you want to make if you're starting from scratch. Find a native, and I've passed along a link.
So many of us have Norway maples, whether we wanted them or not. What about a Norway maple? I hear that's not a native tree, and it certainly spreads.
Yeah, that's not a native tree. It's also not a friendly tree. Now, your kids have peeled the little wings and stuck them on their noses. Well, that stickiness is a latex, and it's a poison that they produce to kill off other plants around themselves and give themselves an advantage. They create a very deep shade. So, as you're maintaining your yard and you have the choice, yeah, you may select to particularly keeping out young and small Norway maples. All trees are doing the job of holding water and cooling the air for us and cleaning things. It's more about what we want to spend our energy on and how we're going to use our efforts in the landscape. So I'm not going to go out of my way to eradicate a bunch of Norway maples and leave a nothing, but I may take one out and replace it with a high quality, say, black cherry. And say a black cherry offers nectar, pollen, fruit, and it's a larval host to hundreds and hundreds of species. I wouldn't put it over my driveway, but I don't want the Norway maple over my driveway either.
Right,
so
right.
There are these things to sort of consider in your landscape and make choices.
Okay. And I think we're standing on a septic field. And so many of us have grass over our septic fields because we believe that's all we can put over our septic fields, right? Is that true?
If you're going to neglect your septic field, that becomes true. But if you're willing to pull some woody weeds out, you can have any other vegetative plants over your septic field. The important thing to understand is that a lot of our vegetative plants have these roots that, just like they die back in the winter from the top, they also die back through the ground in the bottom. And land that has vegetation on it and those vegetative roots are creating tubes that drop down in and then shrivel up. So you get better infiltration than you would otherwise if this is off. Now, you don't want woody plants that can put a root into a pipe and leave it there, but those vegetative plants are going to pull back every year.
So they might actually help the soil over the septic
Yes.
field. And as in the, you know, it would seem simple, but I know in my own experience it isn't. What's woody and what isn't. So it's just, if it dies down completely in the winter, that's good. If some part of it sort of retains life, even without leaves, in the winter, don't put it over your septic field.
Right. If you have to break it or cut it, then you know it's a decent woody plant. If you've got a small tree that's coming up, those are the kind of things you can pull out. But something like the meadow is perfect. And those taller plants also have the deeper root systems, so they're helping to force water down more quickly and more deeply. Another thing you can do, if you're even concerned about that density, this might be your opportunity for some annuals, which amongst the ecologists can be a dirty word. And it definitely is when you're thinking about the annuals you see at the grocery store. I worked in the wholesale greenhouses doing those, and they are dystopian, and those seeds are covered in nicotinoids, which make...
I'm gonna hop in there because that's where we sort of drift off onto things about poisons. And I'd like to sort of refocus and help you think about what it is we're doing in the landscape, more than some of our animal nature. Really things like invasive species and pollutions and poisons are much, much smaller in their overall impact than things like the way we use land. Those end up being sort of side effects of. But we have an emotional animal response to things like a murder hornet that might come get us, or a poison that might sicken us, when we'll ignore something like the pervasiveness of lawn as a problem of a much higher magnitude. So let's focus more on the good things that we can build. Hop over here. With that, we're going to hop over to a new property and take a look.
Hello, here we are on Old Boaton Road here in Stow, across from the park, at a really lovely home with a terrific solar panel to it. But the first thing I want to talk about, and there it is our relationship to the road and to pavement in general. Now, asphalt is useful and plentiful, but it's also really horrible stuff. If we were to tomorrow have every vehicle be completely zero emission, that would still only be about a reduction of half of the emissions from our transportation. The other half is embedded in our asphalt. And right now, there's not a lot we can do about that. There are better materials, but they aren't plentiful. And asphalt, just the technology, isn't advancing. There are advances in concrete, and eventually we'll get there. But for now, it's asphalt, and the only thing we can do is to minimize it. So we want to think about making sure that when you get to town meeting, that they aren't widening your road. Take a look at your driveway, and if it's flat and well drained, maybe you don't need to continue repaving it or resealing it, because the tar in there releases a bunch of volatile organic chemicals, VOCs, PAHs, and even after it's down, it's releasing secondary organic aerosols. So there are a lot of poisons that come off. Now, most of that happens early in the production, but it's still there, and it's still a problem. The only thing we can really do about it is get some trees over it to shade it. The other thing to do is looking at our relationship between the road and home. And you're hearing some of the traffic as it goes by and seeing it, the lights, the motion. We deserve privacy in our homes. And there's a certain character to that. You're living in Stow because you want to be in Stow. When it's lawn straight up to the edge, it might as well be anywhere else in the world. Here we have a chance to do some great things. But when you've got that combination of your solar panel in the right place and the road, you may not have the chance to do the really big trees that will overarch and shade the road and protect us in that way. But something you can do, and something you can pressure your community to do, is to not mow the edges, not to brush hog them, but to let some of those canopy trees grow, and rather than cutting them all back, which sort of opens up the landscape and becomes a way for negative things to come in, pests, weeds, problem plants, even poisons, is to get them there and then take the best species and save them. But we'll take an old farmer's trick and we start bending them down rather than cutting them off. By doing this, we're preserving that root system in the ground that's holding on to carbon, that's making your plant stronger and wider. It's also creating a great deal of cover to keep things you don't want out. This is a way of doing less work, and a whole lot of the best things we can do involve doing less work, doing less mowing, doing less paving, doing less cutting. The next thing we can think about is how we're managing our resources at home. It's a waste of your time and money, and you're bringing in things you don't need when you're buying things like bagged mulch, dyed mulch, things that may be from pallets from a chemical factory in Asia that have been reprocessed and sent to you to stick in your garden or next to your vegetable patch. But here we produce a lot of leaf litter, a lot of woody debris. We want to start working on ways to keep that. That's valuable stuff. And we've got some here in that this is wood chip mulch produced locally. We can save that. It can become a very useful play surface, parking surface, and ground cover when we need it. The thing I'll urge you to do is make sure it ends up in the shade. The other thing we want to look for and build on is our Duff Layer. This is one of the best things in the world. This is where our macroinvertebrates, that's very big but not yet a microbe, soil builders, and fungi live. Now, we have these sort of relationships. We've talked about our keystone species with birds and pollinators helping to move genetic code. But there's another cycle going on here, and it's a cycle under the ground. This relationship between our physical soils, our soil builders, and our trees. These three are working together to sequester carbon. And there are some terrific studies going on right now looking at the relationship between those funguses and carbons, folks at UNH, about why do they differ from forest to forest. But the nice thing about doing these landscapes at home is, yes, there's a lot of complexity to it, but we're looking for the simplicity that happens on the other side of the complexity. And the simplicity is to not blow it all away. Mulch your beds with your own leaf mulch. That way you know what's in it. Yes, you're going to have some weeds, but they're the weeds that are already here and not some new nuisance showing up from parts afar. It also means that you're holding on to those funguses and creatures that are building and improving your soil, that are connecting and strengthening all of your plants. Now, when your solar company came to put the array up on your house, they certainly did a bunch of studies on solar aspect, but we're in New England and things are going to keep growing. Some ways that you can kind of check what you're doing and make decisions about what to plant and where is a simple trick for judging heights. This goes for your vegetable garden as well. What you'll need is a right triangle, and the easy way to do that is a piece of paper. And what we do is judge the height of a tree by getting the bottom of the paper parallel to the ground, and then up to your eye, and walk until you've got that alignment. Now, you can judge the height of the tree by the length from there minus your own height. What you want to do with that is think of April to August as our sort of shadow window. Go all the way out to the equinox for your solar, but say for garden things where you know you want a certain amount of sun, figure twice the height of the tree is that shadow in those key times. In April, the trees haven't filled in yet. You'll still get the sunlight before then. In August, the shadow is a benefit. On the house, go for 2 times the height of your trees relative to where your shadow is, and then subtract out where that shadow would land in the face of your building. So you can get a nice shade on the face of your house without sacrificing your energy. We're here at Canterbury Road, and here we'd like to talk about our relationship to the road and ways that we can modify our landscape to protect our home, our plants, and in particular, our well water. Now, a lot of the bad things that can move around the world move around on our streets. If you look at a road map, it's just like the webbing of roots. It's just like what are those things inside your body? Veins and arteries moving blood around. All the things that can move a disease can move good things. We just have to be ready to make that happen. Now, relative to your road, first thing will be plows and salts, as well as, guests coming up to park. So you do want a certain margin that's built to catch that, and also in some ways built to send it back where it came from. It doesn't need to be paved. To some of the things we've said before, reducing paving is a terrific thing. And while gravel roads that have a slope and end in wetlands can be a problem, if you've got a nice flat driveway or a fairly level gravel road, it's a better thing than asphalt. But as you come onto your property, what's the next thing? Everybody has the big flat green lawn all the way up to the front door. How do we value that? Where did it come from? So the origin of the lawn actually comes from these dukes and earls who wanted to show off their power by what they could waste. I can have this land mowed, hand mowed by peasants, no cattle on it, just to show off what a big shot I am. Well, we guillotined the dukes, but the oligarchs who did that, they sort of saw the lawn and, this is a piece of power, they're going to keep that. So these institutions of power kept that, and then coming into the modern era, we got the gas-powered lawnmower, and hey, everyone can have it. It just became an aesthetic, as well in America, an aesthetic of democracy, having your space open and being everybody's, that you share in that way.
I'd also like to pop in on that one and say that it's also part of our ideas of manifest destiny. Our colonial ancestors equated clearing land with ownership. But today it's all mapped out and GPSed. You don't have to clear it to own it. So we're going to find that chunk of ancestral memory and delete it. From now on, you own your land by maximizing its habitat value. So I'll let him go on again.
But it's not healthy, we're not using it, it's not serving us necessarily. Instead of that vast lawn where you only sit in one cute little corner, maybe we hold on to the cute little corner and get some beds down the edge. Something that can fill in with rich plants, something that gives us privacy, something that feeds our pollinators and birds and builds soil, something with a duff layer, something you don't have to mulch. Down here are worms, salamanders, millipedes, all these really important creatures. And if we leave them in place, like I should be doing, they'll also protect us. One of the only things in the world that can really bind, transform, or break down some of the toxins we do, some of our hydrocarbons, as well as some of our free radical metals, are fungi, mycorrhizae. These are primarily invisible mushrooms under the soil. Now they're becoming more and more available, and you can look up different varieties that you can plant at home with your plants that will then build more soil, strengthen and interconnect your plants, but can also be this barrier to help protect your land and your water. We've looked at one other lawn. But here we're seeing another one, relative to putting your lawn in the shade. Now, we know that our trees are our most valuable asset relative to cooling the land. Under the trees, your land is about 10 degrees cooler than it would be in a hayfield. Another 10 degrees cooler than that, than turf or crops, and a whole another 10 degrees cooler than that, and it is in a city. Think about that 30, 40 degree difference and what that might do to you on a 100 degree day. So, being here in Stow is an excellent hedge against some climate change. And what grows best in that are the native red fescues. These grow slow, low maintenance, they grow in the shade, and you can let it grow to nearly its full length. You'll hardly ever have to mow it. Furthermore, it has this lovely sort of whispery texture. Huh. Look, here's one of your mycorrhizae busy fruiting as we speak. But thinking strategically about what we save, what we do, what sort of work we do, and what we just let it go natural is an important part of what we want to do with our landscapes. We want to be conscientious about these things rather than giving into some of those old stereotypes that are based on oppression or domination. Instead of survival of the fittest and the strongest, we're going to have prosperity of the friendliest.
You mentioned, the history of the lawn and the value actually in degrees of the tree. Now, many people in Stow and other towns would at some point start cutting down trees like this to save their lawn. And that feels like the exact wrong move to make given climate change. You're going to air condition your house more. And, how do we help people know, keep the tree?
Well, first that bit about temperature, but the other piece of when you want to balance out having a lawn and having the trees can be your species selections. Things like this Norway Maple is an allelopath that poisons whatever is under it and has a deep, dense shade, whereas there are other things like the sycamore. Commercially, we call it the plane tree because we are biased in favor of things that are European, and it's a cross with a European tree, so it's better because it's from Europe. But it's not, it's ours, we're keeping it. But it has lovely dappled shade. It also has a texture to the leaves that picks up air pollution more than any other tree. There are other things like black walnuts. Things that have that sort of open, broad leaf have lighter shade underneath them. The other benefit on something like a black walnut is that mosquitoes don't like it. It's releasing phytocins. A lot of our trees are releasing their immune system into the air. Some of the ways they fight viruses, you can walk through a forest and breathe cleaner air when you've got that pine smell. That's pinobanxin. Is a phytocin that helps fight their viruses. It helps us as well. So there are all these pieces, and looking at what types of trees you want to use and which ones that as they start to age out, you may take out a big Norway maple in favor of a different tree. But as you're taking things out, I also want to draw attention to size matters relative to carbon sequestration and water holding. Big trees have proportionally an outsized value, and I'll have some resources for you on that just to show the relative difference of how many hundreds of small trees it would take to do the same job as one or two of these big trees.
Great, thanks.
Call me a snob, but I like laid-back spaces. And it's an important piece to think about in your landscape is, yes, there's the showpiece and the splash, but there's something good about things that are relaxed and that you didn't have to do a lot of work to achieve. The landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted talked about genius loci, the spirit of place. And one of the ways we achieve that is by having the real native plants surround us and form our landscape. You know, let our ground covers be the Virginia creeper. Have the moss. But then with what we're going to do with the space, we want to orchestrate it. So the orchestration of space is deciding, how am I really going to get from place to place? What are the walls, the floors, the ceilings of my garden? And where do I want to move through? And how do I want to shape other people's experiences of my garden, in that leading the eye to things or leading them down into something it's just relaxed and it's easy and it serves its purpose without too much work. While I've got you, I want to bring up something that's a little painful. Some of our relationship to plants and how we decide what are weeds, or what has been decided for us without our knowing it. And two that I'll talk to are black cherry and black gum, the tupelo. Now, in a lot of ways over time, these have been treated as weed trees. Now, some of that is practical in that having cherries drop on your patio or your driveway can be a nuisance. But part of being the black trees is that they're American trees. And historically there was a devaluing of American species and of species that weren't economically or commercially important. Now the tupelo, while it's a terrific wetland tree, a terrific habitat tree, and a terrific pollinator tree, it's not a great building wood. It wasn't easy to reach because it was often in wet areas, but it also, because it's a wetland tree, tends to break up high. It includes pieces that will snap off so that it doesn't fall all the way over in a wetland and get overtaken. For all of these reasons, it's sort of outside the circle of acceptable, whereas...
Paused for a moment, I'll interject. This relationship kind of continues on today. You would have a harder time finding many of these native trees in most nurseries, particularly things like a catalpa or a box elder, because we have given these premature statuses. And even amongst ecologists, they would often put more value on some of these upland trees by sort of looking at forests and habitats that are solid, and say, well, then this is the thing that works. But your garden isn't the same as a forest or a wetland. And a lot of these are edge species trees. That's part of why they're a nuisance to farmers, is they're good on edges. You find a lot of them down along the Assabet still. And that's why I'll recommend some of them to you for your garden. So we'll go back to video.
Whereas chestnut was beautiful and useful, so we cut them all down and turned them into lumber. Others, like elm, black cherry, catalpa. Catalpa is also called the Indian bean tree. Anything that could be associated with natives can get this negative connotation, but these are some of the most valuable plants. After the white oak, the black cherry is host to the greatest number of pollinator species we have, as well as its other values for fruit for our birds. Death, decay, rot, collapse. These are not things we like to associate with, not things we want to associate with our home and our garden necessarily. But in terms of an ecological system, they're really essential. They're about having a complete life cycle. And when we falsify that and hide it, burn it, drag it away, we lose some really valuable properties. Some of these end up being your brush pile or your log pile. Now, there's always, the useful stuff that's split up nicely and is dried and it'll, be your decorative fire. But there are the other awkward pieces, and something you can do to improve habitat in your garden is out on the edge, keep a couple of the oddities and let them molder. Let it be that quiet piece in the distance that says, I'm relaxed about this and I can let it happen. Because while it's doing that, those fungi are coming in, our wood nesting bees, and a bunch of our other soil builders are in there making a home. This can also be a home to a lot of other valuable creatures. One of those ways of getting nature to do some of the work for us would be in terms of mice and ticks. Now, there are a couple of different types of mice. There's mus, the house mouse, who likes to live in houses with people, wanders around, carries some diseases, eats and defecates wherever it is he is, happens to be where he's eating. There's also the white-footed deer mouse, who, can carry some of those same diseases, but he's wild and more discreet about it. Will come out, forage, fill his cheeks, them and the chipmunks do that, and then run home to a burrow. When we hold on to log piles or brush piles, those can be homes for these. So then we have creatures that have a territory that they'll guard against some of those other species and are less offensive. Another way we can move that out is to use them as a pathway to fight against ticks. And we do that by protecting their young. You can treat some cotton balls with permethrin, which is what my environmental scientists and I treat our clothes with. We'll treat those cotton balls and stick them in a container underneath a brush pile so they can be found and used as bedding. This keeps the ticks off of the mice and spreads things around that will kill off some of the ticks, reducing the prevalence of the disease. There goes one of those vectors for toxins, diseases, weed seeds that blow into our yards and get traveled. When they happen in one place, they can happen in many. So having a really strong biological community growing right at the perimeter of your space, maybe even one with some nice stone walls that become habitat for some of those mosquito-eating amphibians and our potential tick vector prevention rodents, is a terrific thing to have. Relative to some of those nuisance plants that are using our roadways as their means of travel, things like the burning bush that came in decades ago is one of the plants that has very low habitat value. One of the few things it helps out is aphids, which aren't that lovable or helpful. But it seeds prolifically, has almost no predators, and it becomes a problem when it gets outside of our yards and down into the wetlands. And we can see that there's some lovely clethra wafting through the air right now, that wonderful vanilla smell. But just before it is a bunch of knotweed. And the knotweed is, even when it has crossed, almost always a clone of itself. It's one of those plants that can really crowd out and endanger some of our native plants while offering almost nothing back. It gives a little bit of nectar and pollen, it holds onto soil and does some biomass, but otherwise it's very low value. Nothing can kind of live in it. Like a lot of things, say the purple loosestrife years ago, we introduced beetles, and now the loosestrife is becoming less of a problem. They are introducing a host-specific beetle for the knotweed, but it's going to take years. So the one time I'm going to advocate to you to spend the effort fighting hard against an invasive species is when it is in a position to threaten a special resource like a wetland. Wetlands are one of our most important landscapes, and they're something that holds on to the most carbon of any of our landscapes. Our forests hold a little bit of carbon, our meadows a little bit less, but our wetlands hold a lot of carbon in. And unfortunately, it's the wooded wetlands are the one type of wetland landscape, okay, a little bit of the salt marshes as well, but that are really in decline, and they're in decline due to filling a little bit of the back 40, or a new development that takes its minimum 5,000 square feet that they're allowed to take. The replications that they build in response to those will take decades to catch up and do the same sort of habitat value or carbon sequestration if they ever get there.
That's an important enough point that I want to hop out for a moment and just illustrate it with a couple of the graphics that I've got together. So I'm going to do a different share. Now, in addition to just heat and landscape, the type of cover makes that big difference in temperature that I had talked about. And this is another piece from UNH looking at our vegetated landscapes, our forests, temperature-wise, and how that changes. So it's not just our greenhouse gases, it's how much water we're capturing in all of these landscapes. And there are some oddities to how things are happening, because really we aren't taking up that much space. And I can't because there we go. And are you guys seeing my screen right now, just to double check? PDF of a map?
Yep, we can see it.
Yep. I talked about those habitat features that you can build. Things like if you've got that big Norway maple, trim it down and leave some of those branches in place, or a trunk, because these are things that have an outsized value to some of those species. And there are a dozen creative things you can do with the stuff in your yard. Done things like, bind it up into wattles and make ropes, or my colleagues down there building a beehive shaped brush pile and carrying it into place. But those pieces of exposed soil and dead things, particularly in their relationship to the species in your forest and in your wetland, are something we want to keep. And here's that bit I'd mentioned about what sorts of landscapes we're losing. And by order of magnitudes, our wetlands are the important piece, at least here in Stow. I chirped a moment on the salt marsh, and while salt marsh doesn't look like it's declined much in the last few years, that's more about we've already gotten rid of all of it. And that's a whole talk for another day, because it's way more important than anything else. And then looking at things in your landscape, like the relative value that they've calculated out for what we can get for carbon and sequestration, and things like managing your lawn. We'll skip forestry for today, but it's wetlands, and then everybody else is a distant second. Same with different things relative to sequestration values. A lot of it is about changing over landscapes, and it's not that the other landscapes table off in their value, whereas the wetland will continue gathering that carbon for thousands of years. At the same time, it releases some gases, some of that carbon monoxide or methane, sorry, but it doesn't have those same sort of negative losses. And I'm going to stop that share. We'll pop back to the video for a moment.
A piece of valuable habitat is the brush pile or brushy thicket and hibernacula as a piece of habitat. And there are some important ways about how you do it. One thing is to not have things that are massive brush piles that could become a fire hazard or that are packed too densely. We want to create open space so that things nearby that may be feeding on a black-eyed Susan have a place. They don't necessarily want to hang a pupa there. They want to tuck it in somewhere safe or hang it from a dry branch that's a little more solid for the winter. A lot of our best amphibians and macroinvertebrates and soil builders will also favor this. It also means that you're not going through the effort of carefully clipping things up and tossing them in a bag and sending them off to the transfer station along with who knows what kind of seed might have gotten in there and ending up in everyone else's yard when that compost is sold or repurposed for ball fields. We all have the portion of our gardens that we use and occupy. There's the spaces where we're going to sit out and have a meal with friends, places where we're growing our vegetables or our grapes. But a lot of times there's the wide portion around the back where there isn't so much going on, except for mowing lawns. And well, unless you're really enjoying riding around on a mower, that's not doing anything good for you. This is an opportunity to help hold on to water, improve the amount of water and the consistency of water in your land by having trees, cool the neighborhood and the region by having some trees. It can also be an opportunity for some advantages. You can do fruit trees for your own personal use because a lot of these contribute to our pollinators and birds, other animals. Something else you can do are trees for harvesting sake. When you have enough space, there are agencies you can coordinate with to have valuable hardwoods, things like white oak, black walnut, linden. These are woods that sell for significantly more than the typical pine that we build with. And while New England isn't known for really doing a whole lot with our wood, we are able to grow it. The trick ends up being coordinating amongst each other to make sure that those become accessible and resaleable. Because frankly, we still import like 95% or more of our building materials when we could be growing more of that. Strategically, for the small spaces we have, we could be growing those custom hardwoods and putting that aside as something. That keeps the portion of the tree that grew sequestered as a building material. The portion that's in the ground, the stumps stay, and most of those will sucker and regrow from where they are and become a perpetual investment. They also remain an open space that you can use. It just remains a little bit shadier and a little bit cooler. So when you have a back 40 that isn't busy being used for a soccer game, because that's a perfectly valid reason to have a lawn, consider some alternatives.
You just said that growing trees helps, or a growing tree helps secure more water in your landscape. How does that work? I would think it would evaporate, soak it up and evaporate it.
It's a common misconception about things. People think, oh, it's wet out back, I'll plant some willows and that'll soak it all up. That's not the case. The portion of a tree above ground holds a whole lot of water in the trunk, in the foliage, but it also holds it in the air. by not allowing things to evaporate off, we get more water with a tree than we would without. And even with grasses, ground covers, and meadows, proportionally, the more vegetation you have on it, the better it is at holding water, and the better it is getting that water into the ground. When you have stripped land, you've seen it before where it will become dry and dusty and blow around very, very quickly. But if you peel up in that same dry area a patch of sod or throw a shovel in under a plant, you can feel the moisture in that soil. It's counterintuitive, but it's a proven fact that having our plants hold on to water, they also help to increase the frequency of rain locally. So the more trees we have, the cooler we are, and so we get more water.
Okay, thanks.
For landscape nuisances and threats to some of our better native plants, you can't get worse than bittersweet. And there isn't really a great way to fight against it. The only thing you really can do is to keep after it, but don't overburden yourself. Keep it cut out of the trees, chop it back where you can to keep it from fruiting. That's the biggest piece for right now. Eventually, these plants aren't going to go away. They're going to become a permanent part of our landscape. But in terms of us, we think and live in decades, whereas a forest feels and lives in millennia and in centuries. They're going to be just fine with these plants in time. It's the fact that they have to live with us and invasive species. So doing our part by keeping them out of the major trees is the best thing you can do with it. Another piece of adding connectivity, we've talked about how roads connect and bring species back and forth. Relative to our wetlands, there's a special piece of vulnerability right now. With the flux in climate change, vernal pools are in danger, particularly the small ones. Now, vernal pool is just what its name is forest pool. Small ponds that happen in the winter to spring and dry up over the summer. These are essential for a lot of our amphibians, invertebrates, some of our reptiles. Now, they need to be within about 100 feet of a wetland, and they have a sphere of influence around 700, 800 feet. To make those stable as we get more volatile climate, the small ones will dry up too much and anything in them will be lost. Something we can do is look up where your potential vernal pools and certified vernal pools are, where your wetlands are. Go on MassGIS Oliver, and we'll provide a link, and look for these resources and see if there are things you can do to help. Something you can do is to, out at the edge of your wetland, have yourself a frog pond. Your small pool, because you can make sure it's wet in that dry year, may become the stopover point that helps species get to the next resource, or a small life pod that, because you can control whether it has water, doesn't dry up when those small vernal pools are lost, so that these species can recolonize after a disaster.
Okay, so those are some of those sites, and relative to the last one, I'm going to show you a piece of that state mapping tool that's available to us, or a clip from it. Let's see, did I get there? That's the one on share. Is that showing up as a map now?
Yes, yes, it is.
Okay, good. Okay, so this large blue dot is where we were. And this is the state's MassGIS Oliver tool, public online website. But you can do a search for different words of different things and find out things about or around your property. And the one that I'll point out is vernal pools. And Stow is a wetlandy place and has a couple of them, but what if, say, every couple of houses down, someone had a frog pond that they make sure is filled, say, February to June, and let it dry out so there aren't fish, particularly in drought years when things may need to move from one space to another and need a stopover. We can become one of those missing links. So these are the sort of ideas that I want to put forth for people as to what to do in your own garden. Relative to these as a gestalt. Now, there are lots of bits and pieces that I've thrown out there, and some of them are fairly thin. We're kind of skimming across the surface of these topics broadly. But the big point is to be strategic about what you do and where. So at your home, think about strengthening your borders and your boundaries, strengthen your relationship to road, make sure that inside your yard, you are a well-stocked pantry of good things that can be shared, particularly in lean times. We've got terrific agencies doing conservation and environmental protection, but that's in certain categories. The agencies, the entities that have a bigger impact on overall ecology are really homeowners and DPWs and the state DOTs, because that's the landscape that's tied together and spread out. So I'm hoping that inspires you to take some of these things on at home. That's everything I've got for now, despite some bizarre technical difficulties that kept me from putting in some of my notes and clips, but I'll put those together so you've got them as a resource later. We got any question or discussion we want to tie back to something?
First of all, I just want to say thank you, Casey-lee. As you could tell, he tied together a whole bunch of stuff and a whole bunch of Stow properties to give us this this talk. And thank you to Stow TV for all those various clips. So questions? You may have a question, but you may still be on mute. You can unmute now. I see Carol. Carol has one.
Yeah, I live in a community of houses with homeowners association, and we have a whole big patch, and that's part of our well system. And I was told that right now it's just all grass, and I was told that we can't plant on that above where our wells are there. And I noticed that we live close to Bowes, and I noticed that Bowes has if you go up around behind Bowes, they have a huge area that's their well system, and it's a field with flowers, and so they basically built like a little prairie. So what's the answer on that? Can you? I know you said that it's good to plan on where you've you got your sewage stuff, but what about planting over where a well is?
Someone is mistaken. It is radically better to have forested land over and around your well. Most of the town wells are in forested protected land. I'm in Marlborough. We've got a chunk there, and we're running out of water anyway. It's probably someone thinking about their access and their maintenance. And this is one of these big mind pieces that we need to get a hold of the maintenance guys. And it's hard to do because asking people to change is almost like asking them to admit some sort of wrong. And we need to be the ones sort of twisting that around and going, no, we have some terrific advantages for you. And we're going to take away some terrible things, like that guy on the mower. It's not usually one of us, is it? It ends up being someone sort of disadvantaged. Well, statistically, from OSHA standpoint, they're losing about 10 years of their life, and more likely to live in pain, more likely to suffer lung diseases because of the type of work we're asking them to do. We could do so much more with just a pair of loppers.
Another question. Anybody else? Sharon.
Thank you, Casey-lee. As a gardener, one there may be a zealous nature in us in terms of looking at trees that have dead branches and pruning them and cutting out the dead branches. Is that something you should do? Is it okay to do? Is that, I mean, how active should we be in doing that in terms of pruning our trees and shaping them?
I suggest pruning for safety hazards that will fall or that might damage something that's visually ornamental. But otherwise, the dead portions of a tree, you know, in fact, particularly trees that have a little bit of death in them, become excellent habitat. That's one of those values I mentioned in the Tupelo, is that it tends to live despite breaking, and that becomes home to a lot of birds and bees and other creatures. So try to minimize what you cut. Cut where you want to cut. You can cut, but avoid chipping things if you can. That's sort of like, you know, keep it, that's a C grade, make a nice brush pile, that's a B grade, leave it standing as a snag, or if it's a log that's dropped, get it parallel a slope so that it's catching some water. Maybe seed it with a couple of turkey tail mushroom plugs or some other edibles. Those are fun. So try and make better use of that and think about this very complete life and death cycle. We want to be completely alive and not pretending to be alive with a perfectly green all the time lawn.
We have a question in the chat from Abby Morgan. If we want to hire someone for guidance to improve and update our property, do you have recommendations?
I would say go through the ELA. I think it's recently changed its name, but they have directories of qualified specialist landscape designers and maintenance crews. But at the other end, you know, if we want to spread these values, grab the landscaper you have and twist his arm and say, no, you can't come back here until you've got an electric mower. No, take off the backpack blower. You're not allowed to use that on my property anymore. I will still pay you, and it's going to look like you did less work, but you're doing more good.
And Peter has a question for you.
Yeah, thanks. You pointed out all the different critters that live in the fallen leaves, and I forget the word you use, but all the stuff that's on the ground. How aggressive should raking be, or should we not be raking, or, you know, what effect does that have on the yard and everything else in it?
Rake where you want to walk. Push things off to where they can stay. You don't want to be thrashing things up, putting them through a mulcher. The worst thing is to bag it up and send it off to the transfer station where it's going to, you know, move around the world, and where you've just lost, you know, 40, 50 pounds of your carbon. That's hard-earned carbon. It's yours. That's our treasure. We're going to keep that. Even if you don't want it out on your lawn, it can go off into your woods or into your vegetable patches. And I had a terrible moment with a DOT engineer about you can't plant trees in my thing, it'll fill with leaves. Like, yeah, the way that forests always fill with leaves. After 5-10 years, you know, you get a foot of leaves every year. Soon you can't walk into a forest, right? No, these things, if they've got a decent group together with them, it turns into soil pretty well.
Thanks.
And Sharon's got another question. Yeah.
So my understanding is that you shouldn't be too aggressive in cleaning your garden in the fall, that you should leave things. Is there sort of a middle ground? I mean, some areas in your garden, you probably want to maybe just clean them so that you don't get it overburdened. I mean, can you do sort of a mix?
Yes, you can. Your garden is for you, and you can clean as much as you want. You're not going to be a defining characteristic. It's a matter of changing our perspective about this and going, you know, what here can I leave very comfortably? That's that line that we want to aim for. With a lot of things, I still pull weeds, but I lay them down and prop up the roots so that they'll dry out and die back into my beds.
Anyone else have a question for Casey-lee? That may be it for tonight. Casey-lee, this has been terrific. I have a feeling that you may get postcards in the mail from people who look at the video and go, wait a minute, I didn't ask this. But thank you.
That'd be fine, and I'll give an email address. I'm crazy busy right now because this is an important category. So if I don't get back to you right away, be a little forgiving, that's all.
Well, I thank everybody for coming, and the next program, Rick, do you have the date for the next program?
Yeah, it is the last Wednesday in October, October 27th.
7th.
And we'll be working with examples of greenhousing that are being built in Devons. We'll be talking with the architect and with the local town planner. And these have a lot of implications, I think, for housing that may be being developed in Stow soon. So it's very interesting. We were just out there shooting last week. So thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.